In carrying out any kind of military or security operations, from a national military to police forces, are those being carried out primarily by American soldiers or NATO soldiers, or those carried out by local national kind of forces? It's not surprising to me that many of the most recent bombings that have taken place in Iraq have targeted national police stations and recruiting stations, because what the opposition there is trying to do is to undermine the ability of the national governments, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, to carry out those security functions themselves. If you still see American soldiers taking the lead in those kind of operations, you still see many villages and towns depend on their security by American or NATO forces, particularly in Afghanistan. That's not a good sign. To the extent that you see national forces and national police carrying out those functions and doing so effectively, that's a measure of progress. Other kinds of indicators or things I would look at for local security: how many roads are functional and how much traffic is taking place on those roads in the country at hand? How many of those have been subject to violent attacks? How many landmines or roadside bombs are there along those transit lines there? The United States military and the news media often report various data or statistics that tell you how many roadside bombs or mines have been successfully removed. I actually consider the higher that number a bad sign. You may be successful in preventing attacks by doing that, but the more number of mines and roadside bombs you have means the more of those that have been planted that you need to remove. So in some ways, fewer mine removals and fewer of those is actually a good thing, providing they don't kind of blow up. Other kinds of indicators and things you would look at to see whether local security is established is not always just looking at how many people have been killed, the number of shooting incidents that take place, the number of terrorist attacks. Those are all important. But in many ways, the best judges of local security often are the people who live there. And I'd take a close look at their own activities. Do the people who live there consider it safe to travel to market, to work, and to school? And the more activity you see in that, the better indicator is that they think it's safe to go there. Because ultimately, how safe something is a perceptual thing, and often the best judges are those who have to live in it, not somebody who's conducting analysis at UN headquarters in New York or in the State Department in Washington, D.C. When you put those together, I think you can, with a series of other kinds of facts, you can start to render judgment over whether local security has been established well or not. And you can also use that as a way to track progress to see whether you're making that progress or whether you're slipping back. The second kind of goal that I think is in the interest of all the stakeholders is establishing the rule of law. And by that I mean that political decisions are made according to the rule of law, and disputes between individuals and groups are settled by legal and political mechanisms and not by violence. One of the signs of a healthy society is not one that has an absence of disagreements, but one that's characterized by having those disagreements settled peacefully. So how do we know, or what kind of signs would indicate that Afghanistan or Iraq settles its conflicts by a rule of law? A prerequisite, it seems to me, is that there needs to be a legal framework exist in order to do that. And the first step for that is an approval of a national constitution with appropriate guarantees of rights and democratic and legal processes. But beyond that kind of legal framework, you have to make sure that it's not just the framework exists, but the key political actors involved and the groups and the individuals actually follow that framework. The Constitution and the legal framework has to have meaning. There's a variety of things I've looked at, but let me give you a few kind of ideas. I'd want to take a look at whether that society systematically places a large portion of its population in pretrial detention or other types of prisons, particularly where there are no human rights protections. And when one looks at those facilities and processes, how many of those operate under international human rights standards? Clearly, societies that place individuals, largely who are political opponents, in jail and hold them without those kind of human rights protections are not operating under the rule of law. You also want to look at some more obvious things to the extent to which those individuals held by the government or other groups are subject to torture, degrading, or other treatment that violates international human rights standards. But beyond that, you want a close look at how the legal system operates. Are there functioning courts? Is there a record-keeping kind of system that one can track legal cases through the system and detect abuse that takes place? How many judges have been kidnapped, assassinated, or intimidated? Because the legal operating system is more than just its rules. The individuals who are in charge of carrying it out have to feel free to do that according to the rule of law and not out of fear or political cronyism. And for certain societies, particularly in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and some of you may say this is true in the United States as well, most interesting to me would be the number of criminal cases that involve elites in society that are taken to trial and the number of those that are actually result in conviction. Sometimes the best test of a legal system is one that can take legal action against its most powerful members, whether they're the business, military, or political elite, and obtain appropriate kinds of convictions and punishment when they've done wrong. Put that together, and a healthy sign for Afghanistan and Iraq is when you start to see disputes and disputes that are solved by violence or fights replaced by those that take place that the battles take place in courts of law. Last, at least for this presentation, I have a whole series of others, is issues that deal with local governance. And by that I mean that countries like Afghanistan and Iraq can actually govern themselves. It's not merely just a matter of establishing security. It's not having the